about this notion of we were never meant to obey, what I'm really saying is that children are the ultimate teachers in terms of what true freedom looks like. Children, when they first come into this world, they're incredibly creative, they're innovative, they are their true selves, and they have no shame. They will tell you when you stink, they'll tell you how they feel about you, they will tell you anything they want. And in that, for me, that's true freedom, the ability to just exist without others constantly trying to mold you, without our institutions constantly trying to mold you into an ideal type. Something that's on my mind currently is closer to home. It's thinking more about how does obedience function, not just in these formal spaces that we live, but how is obedience conditioned from a young age? How is it conditioned in our interpersonal relations, our interactions, and even how we look in the mirror, how we see ourselves, how do we self-censor? And this was sparked because a man that I interviewed in my book, who ended up spending over 40 years in prison, many of those years in Supermax in solitary confinement, he said to me, actually my first experience with control, with being held in solitary, was as a child being held in a closet for hours and hours on end. How is control conditioning us in ways that we may not think about or that might be painful to think about? And one thing that I do want to leave you with is, in my inquiry, which has also been a self-exploration of the themes of my book, I've come to see how our life scripts and the way that we are taught to be inauthentic and the way that we get rewarded for being inauthentic and being a version of ourselves that isn't true, I believe that that's really the heart of social control. And so in that way, it's kind of like the reward, right? The feeling of being safe, being you. And so I invite you to think about who makes you feel that way, where do you feel that way, and where don't you? And how can we extract ourselves from those spaces and create new, not just fugitive spaces, but I'm thinking like big, abundant, beautiful spaces.
We've heard that schools should not teach about critical race theory. We hear this debate about schools getting banned from teaching about race. And I'm here to share that all schools teach about race. The question is how. So how do they teach about race? Do they teach about it in a way that is directly? For example, what is race? How has racism functioned in our society? How to work towards anti-racism? So teachers can be intentional in the way that they teach about race and work towards anti-racism. But most of the time, schools teach about race in ways that are indirect. So for example, teaching about how, for example, Europeans have the better history, that's one way of teaching about race. Another way of teaching about race is indirectly. So for example, withholding or banning ethnic studies curriculum and not talking about African civilizations, not talking about tribal sovereignty, for example. These are all ways that schools indirectly teach about race by withholding histories, by withholding the experiences of certain groups in our society. Schools also teach about race indirectly by, for example, having some schools, for example, schools with more white students, have better resources than schools that serve, for example, brown and black students. That way is a very indirect way for schools to teach about race, and it teaches about race in ways that we don't really recognize, because by giving some schools better resources than others, then they also reinforce the outcomes that we see in our society. Which students perform better in some schools versus others. And those students then have higher outcomes in schools, and we recognize these patterns, and we think that race actually does exist in our society. And we then justify providing more resources, better teachers, better school funding, etc., to students in better resource schools. So it's a cycle.
On January 21st of this year, Donald Trump issued an executive order that did away with 60 years of affirmative action and DEI programs, diversity, equity, inclusion, in public and private sector jobs and college admissions. In a twisted bit of irony, Trump claims that these programs violate our civil rights laws. particularly those found in the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This is a gross misrepresentation of what affirmative action is, what it aimed to do, and the kind of limits that it experienced for its 60-year run. So why is this important? Well, just this afternoon, Trump's Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, just announced that the Women's Peace and Security Act would no longer be enforced, describing it as a bill that was divisive and woke. But Hegseth didn't get the memo that the act actually became law during the Trump's first administration. And it was authored by Marco Rubio and endorsed by Ivanka Trump. It is a law that was supposed to give women in the military the opportunity to assist with conflict resolution and post-conflict rebuilding in war-ravaged areas. It's important for us to understand the history of affirmative action and diversity, equity, and inclusion because the erosion of our rights and our protections is happening right now. So let's start with a little history of affirmative action. After the world saw how folks in the South turned water hoses and dogs on black children in Birmingham, Alabama, John F. Kennedy proposed the Civil Rights Act that would end segregation in public facilities and create better voting rights protections. But the Southern Dixiecrats didn't like that. They were outraged by the growth and popularity of Martin Luther King Jr. and the Civil Rights Movement, and they were particularly pissed off about the March on Washington. So what they did was try to kill the bill. And the way they tried to do that is through a Virginia congressman named Howard Smith, who inserted the word sex into the language of the bill in order to try to kill it. His idea was that no one would be stupid enough to believe that American women were experiencing gender discrimination. But Kennedy was assassinated, and so this plan is backfired, and the word sex remained in the bill, even though that was not its intent. In July 1964, the Civil Rights Act was passed, which prohibited discrimination on the basis of race, color, sex, religion, national origin, as well as providing protections in public accommodations. It ended racial segregation in schools and federal employment. It was a landmark piece of legislation, but it had limits. The Civil Rights Act is a non-discrimination policy. All it does is it prohibits discrimination, but it does not require steps are taken to ensure equality and justice. That's where affirmative action comes in. So a year later, in 1965, President Johnson issued Executive Order 11246. That is the law that created affirmative action in federal hiring and employment. It's a type of positive law, which means proactive steps have to be taken to meet the requirements of the law. So take, for example, a construction company that might be working on a federal building has to show they've taken steps to include black people or women or immigrants for these good government jobs. They have to be provided an opportunity to get the job. They do not have to be, they are not required by law to give those jobs or set those jobs aside for them. So this is one of the big misrepresentations and fallacies about affirmative action. It never required racial quotas. It offered that as a possibility, but it did not. The practice of setting aside a number of seats for black and brown folks, like I said, was an option, but it was never required by the federal government. What the feds did require was that companies create some affirmative action goals, and the government would create an agency to help support those goals. But everybody was so upset and angry about affirmative action, full stop, that by 1978, with the Bakke versus UC decision, racial quotas were formally outlawed. Race could be used as a factor, but not the factor in college admissions and hiring. So anyone going around talking about their kids didn't get into UCLA or Princeton because some black and brown folks got some extra seats, they are lying. Because no university in their right mind would risk losing access to federal dollars just to provide some safe spaces. The reason why we have DEI is because Ronald Reagan tried to get rid of affirmative action. He wanted to get rid of affirmative action at the federal level, and so he we encourage companies to go ahead and start to do diversity hiring because it's good for business. So you start to see this neoliberal shift from giving people an opportunity to giving people an opportunity if you can make a lot of money off of them and no government regulation. DEI has been good for big business. Amazon and Target and all of those other companies made a lot of money off of this. In 2020, the diversity market was valued at $3.4 billion. It was projected to be $18 billion by 2027. And what happened? Donald Trump's re-election against Biden. The GOP needed a culture war issue in order to bring people out to the polls. And nothing brings people out more than identity politics. Affirmative action on paper looks great, but it takes a whole lot of effort to enforce a law. And my book, Black Women on Board, really deals with the enforcement of affirmative action. What did it take for people to get a law enforced? In this case, this black woman had to cook dinner for white men in order to get access to the Board of Trustees in the California State University system so she could position herself to advocate for students of color. Imagine having to cook dinner for folks and play hostess, even though you're the most educated person on the board, just so that you can have some equal access.
This again is Brains Uncorked, and I hope that you'll join us every month as we invite 3 speakers, 3 brilliant professors to talk about the subject near and dear to their hearts. Thank you again.